I mean, I'm the luckiest guy in the world in a way in terms of writing and stuff, because I wasn't going to, I wanted to be a writer at Harvard, but I got an F in my gen ed, writing thing. So I thought, oh, okay, I don't know. In fact, my first grading, I handed in an essay, and this woman said, Miss Heller, her name was, I still remember, said there weren't any marks on it, except down at the bottom, see me. So I wanted to be a writer. So I went into this little cubicle, and there she is, this scared, woman. And she said to me, this is the feedback for me, a country boy from Hudson, New York, scared to death they'd taken me because I was a golfer or something, or basketball. And she said, this paper is too bad to mark. It's below F. Below F. That's pretty low, And I started crying because I wanted to be a writer. And so I never wrote another thing at Harvard for that year. But that was a good thing, because so many of the people that put down, I want to be a writer in the freshman yearbook thing, never were, when we got to the 20th reunion or 25th, I was pretty much the only fiction writer. And that's because they started too early. And I couldn't start till I had to have the stuff to start that was original. But I was writing very happily. I loved writing. I finally could do it full time. And 7 years ago, I get a call. And it says, do you want to be a professor in medicine at NYU? I said, what? Why? Well, we want you to teach. I said, what do you want me to teach? I said, I want you to teach the House of God. Now, Harvard hated me for the House of God, and here's this big institution wanting me. We want you to give a seminar on the House of God. So I started it. And here's the thing that really, I just can't believe my luck, because I was out of medicine. And so with clear eyes, not having been in medicine, I was all of a sudden on wards and looking at what's what. And I realized the absolute miracles that we can do now in medicine. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable from when I trained. But as the same narrator says, Roy G. Bash is the narrator of Man's Fourth Best Hospital, the sequel. As he says at the beginning, looking back, he says, it was a time when medicine could go either one of two ways, either toward more humanity, or money and screens, which means in the modern hospital, money and money, because the computer screens that you see your doctor doing this on, it's not for your good. Basically, it's to bill. They're billing machines. And the doctor is being forced to bill the highest rate for the hospital. And it's like a war. On the other side, the insurance drone is trying to pay the least. The doctors are forced to spend something between 60% and 70% in front of those screens every day. One of the things I had to do then, that was my job, is I had another one of these, hey, wait a second moments. And it's, what gets me going is a sense of injustice. And with the House of God, it was just medical training. This one was the system, the whole system, right? So I studied, learned. I mean, it took me ages. And in the middle of the book, the fat man, you'll read it, gets up and says to his new team at Man's Fourth Best Hospital, the 6 rackets of American healthcare, follow the money. And there are all these intertwined things. Yeah, I had to learn. And at the end, he says what to do. The basic story of this is Man's Fourth Best Hospital. This may sound a little familiar to the Boston crowd. The Man's Fourth Best Hospital used to be Man's First Best Hospital for many years. And then all of a sudden, because of something called buddies, which is an overarching thing, right? that has no purpose, but that costs a lot of money, that controls all these different hospitals, right? Um, uh, they, for some reason, for mismanagement and all that, go down in the rankings from number one to number four, fourth best. And it's a, excuse me, it's a WASP hospital. All the board members get very scared. In the book, it says one even got a little depressed. A board member depressed. Anyway, and so they're losing money. They're lost prestige. What do they got? Who do they call up? They call up the fat man, who's made a ton of money in Silicon Valley, and he has prestige. He has a lot of money, and so they say, do whatever you want to do. And what he wants to do, and this was me figuring, what do I want to show? How do I get into this? What he wants to do is to have a public uh, a public out, office in right up against the big hospital, public clinic up against the big hospital. And what he wants, and he rounds up most of the, Chuck and Roy and Eat My Dust Eddie and Hyper Hooper and all those guys from the House of God. He brings them in because they're not very happy with their jobs. And he says, we are going to show how to put the human back into medicine, how to put the human back into medicine. And that was my job as the writer. I had to create the clinic, I had to create, all of this and how to do it. And so that's what the book's about.
Next Harvard-Radcliffe class of 66 author is Lawrence Devoe of Augusta, Georgia. Lawrence has had a distinguished career in obstetrics and gynecology as professor at the Medical College of Georgia at Augusta University. He's published over 300 scholarly papers and abstracts, taught over 10,000 medical students, among other career accomplishments. Lawrence's book, Yankee by Birth, Southern by Choice, is an account of this Chicagoan's discovery of the United States and becoming a full-fledged Southerner. Is that an apt description of the title of your book?
That's absolutely very close.
So, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, there were a couple of things. By way of background, I have Southern heritage through one of my grandfathers, who was born in Kentucky, and then his family moved to Louisiana. And he introduced me to the South when I was 14. And I spent a week with relatives I'd never met before, and I couldn't understand a single word that they said because they had very few accents. But I did learn how to drink sweet tea, which is one of the beverages of the South, along with Coca-Cola.
Absolutely.
And then I had a second round in the South when I got drafted during Vietnam as a medical officer, and spent 2 wonderful years, 731 days and nights, and I counted them all, at Fort Benning, Georgia. So that was my second encounter of the South. And the third and final one was when I moved there to Augusta, Georgia in 1983 to join the faculty in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Medical College of Georgia. And what was supposed to be a maybe 4 or 5 year move, because people who are in academic medicine often do that. They do what they need to do in one place and then job hop to the next place for a higher rank and more money. I married a Southerner, and not just a Southerner, but a daughter of the Deep South, who could trace her origins back to colonial times, so that you don't get more Deep South than that.
No.
And once you tie that kind of knot, it never lets go. And so this has been my home for more than half my life.
What were your greatest misconceptions about the South, its people, history, and culture?
Well, I think one of the things that all Yankees, of which I was a former Yankee, but I don't consider myself to be a Yankee anymore, a couple of things. First of all, Southerners typically have a drawl. And my grandmother, who was married to my Southern grandfather, was a Yankee. And she considered the fact that the drawl really made Southerners sound like they were a little slow-witted, which is clearly not true. It does take a little longer for the words to reach your ears. Then again, it's a very gentle form of speech, and they can say things to you that aren't very nice, but they sound okay if they come out with a Southern drawl. One of my favorite expressions is, "Well, bless my heart." You can use that in a number of circumstances, some of which are telling a person that they might not be so bright or that you had it coming to you. But I've had this book in me for probably my entire life. And I remember a conversation that I had we had a local writer, poet, short story writer, raconteur, who was from the Augusta area, old Augusta area, I should say. And we were at a cocktail party, and I asked him, his name was Starkey Flight, and I asked Starkey, I said, do you have to be born a Southerner to write about the South? And in his inimitable way, he said, no, but it sure does help. So I had to come up with a way of doing this, because most of my readers are going to be Southerners, because that's who knows about the book. And I did it in such a way where I was non-judgmental. I described the things about Southern living which are very desirable. I mean, there are some drawbacks, but compared to life in the North, we began as a human species growing up in a tropical climate. We were never intended to live in the tundra with freezing cold winds, snow and ice and all that. So I figure I'm just coming back to my real roots, that I was destined to be a Southerner all my life. It just took me, 38 years actually to realize that. The first half is really a personal journey. The second half actually is more or less a guide to Southern living, where I do cover things like climate adaptation, Southern food. I had never really had grits before I moved to the South. And I said, well, I'm not sure I would like this. Can I just have a grit? And they said, no, you have to have grits. So that was part of it. I do eat grits every so often, but there's a whole cuisine here. And actually, a lot of it is pretty delicious. And I got used to it after a while, because when I visited my in-laws, that's what they had for lunch or dinner. So there's a chapter on Southern food, and Southerners like to drink. So there's a whole chapter that's devoted to Southern beverages. And then there's a chapter devoted to things that are worth seeing and doing in the South, getting around. If you like fishing or hunting or camping or hiking, there's plenty of that here, and you can do it most of the year. There's a chapter on learning how to speak Southern, because it's a language in and of itself, and it takes a while. I didn't speak Southern when I came. I had a nurse who translated for me so I could understand what the patients were trying to tell me. But after a while, I caught on to the dialect. And then there's a whole chapter about that. And it's something, if you're going to make this your home, you need to learn at least how to understand Southern, if not to adopt the accent. And I think finally there's a chapter in there as well in just looking at the virtues of Southern living in all aspects of life. And the pace is slower, but you'll still get there. It just won't be at the speed of light. And that the people are as a group, the nicest, warmest, most welcoming people I've ever met in my entire life. My Southern family, I did the unthinkable. There are three types of Yankees, Fred. There's the Yankee who goes to the South for a visit and then comes home. Then there's the damn Yankee, goes to the South for a visit and stays. And then there's the goddamn Yankee who goes to the South for a visit, stays, and marries a Southern belle. So I won't tell you which one I am, but you could like one.
Paul Cantor, our classmate in class of 1966, is a full professor of English at the University of Virginia, still teaching,
Yes.
and a very, very prolific author of many books and papers, but focusing today on two of the recent publications, the Gilligan Unbound and the Invisible Hand in Popular Culture. Paul, you want to tell us a little bit about which of these books you'd like to discuss?
I can do both, but let's start with Gilligan Unbound.
Okay.
All right. Well, I've been interested in popular culture all along, ever since I was a child. I kind of grew up with television. I was born in 1945, and I used to like to talk about TV shows with my brother and with other people. When I got to Harvard, I found my fellow students were pretty much also interested in movies and television, and that helped me to get started thinking about popular culture in a somewhat more serious way. I remember days in the Lowell House TV room. This was the heady late 1960s where we watched Batman debut.
I remember seeing you there.
Okay. Well, I wasn't trying to disguise myself. And we used to watch Star Trek, the original Star Trek. And whenever Bill Shatner warmed up for his big speech, we'd shout, Emmy, Emmy, because we knew what he was going for. And I kind of put this interest on hold, but the more I studied Shakespeare, for example, the more I realized that he was the popular culture of his day. He was the most commercially successful playwright in London. We tend to think as if Shakespeare must have been produced by the equivalent of public TV then, but no, he was just commercial art, very successful with the public. And I began to see that what we call high art in many, many cases was the popular culture of its day. Verdi's operas, for example, Dickens' novels. I began to theorize that basically what we call high culture is the popular culture of earlier days that have survived. And so I thought, okay, maybe I should start figuring out what part of our culture today is going to survive. And in fact, in recent, really the past decade, the canon of television has begun to emerge, the shows that people think are among the greatest. There's pretty good consensus emerging about, people will pick The Sopranos and The Wire and Deadwood and several other shows. And so I put together this book. I knew I was going to work on The Simpsons, and I knew I was going to work on The X-Files. And I asked myself, well, what do those two shows have in common? And the answer was globalization. That here we were, this was the 1990s, that the biggest subject in those days was globalization. And the X-Files portrayed globalization as a sinister process. It shows its lesson was the people you think are ruling your country are not. There's this shadowy conspiracy of international bankers who are running your country. And then I thought, The Simpsons, it's an awful lot about globalization and that. There's a local TV station in Spanish. The local 7-Eleven is run by Apu Nahasapina Petalon. And so on. I thought, well, the X-Files presents globalization as sinister and serious. The Simpsons presents it as comic. And so there I suddenly had, okay, here's the basis of the book, but what should I do? And then I was, well, globalization is new in television. Let's go back and see what was going on in the 60s. And I hit upon, there was Gilligan's Island again, sitting there waiting for me, and Star Trek. That is, what occurred to me was that the globalization of American television was in response to decades of the Americanization of the globe. So the opposite process. The weird thing about Gilligan's Island, and I hope you've seen some episodes of it, the premise of the show was that you could drop an average group of Americans any place on the globe and they'd rule it. and they'd fight off any enemies of America. And so I then contrasted Gilligan's Island with The Simpsons. And to contrast with The X-Files, I chose Star Trek. Star Trek, which was an incredible late 60s show in the sense that James Tiberius Kirk was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, that it was suffused with the whole New Frontier spirit of the Kennedy administration. This would be a Harvard in-joke, but I thought of Mr. Spock as McGeorge Bundy with pointy ears. Here we had Captain Kirk with his brain trust. And now it wasn't just the globe that was being Americanized, but the entire galaxy. That again, in the show reflected such a sense of American self-confidence that the Enterprise could go anywhere in the galaxy and impose an American way of life on it. The second book was also done with Steve Rinn. He had transferred to the University of Notre Dame press at that point, but he came up with a title. I couldn't come up with a title for the second book, but he came up with this title, and I think it works. Namely, one thing I tried to show is the way a number of works in popular culture actually illustrate Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand. But also I wanted to show that the very existence of popular culture is the invisible hand in action. That is, there's a great deal of contempt of popular culture among academics. I don't think it's justified. There's a lot of garbage in popular culture, but there's a lot of creative work as well. And I'm willing to say that if you lined up the best 100 movies of America in the 20th century, and now maybe even the best 100 TV shows, they'd line up pretty well with the cultural achievement of any other century, the best 100 novels of the 19th century, the best operas of the 19th century. Popular culture has nothing to be ashamed of. I point out, it's estimated there are hundreds of thousands of novels written in 19th century Britain. We don't know any of them. We know like 0.5% of them. And it's in the nature of culture that you try out a lot of things, and occasionally the good things come into being and survive. And I think the survival rate of movies and television shows is comparable to other fields. Most of what we call elite culture is an illusion. People think Shakespeare was the elite culture as they absolutely not. The guy made more money than anybody else because his plays were so popular. He was the only playwright who had what Hollywood would call a percentage of the gross. He was a shareholder in the theater company. Everyone else was paid like 50 pounds a play. Shakespeare had, I think, a 10% share in the theater company. He ended up the equivalent of a millionaire. He was able to buy the second biggest house in Stratford. So, the Invisible Hand book covers all sorts of things. I'm particularly proud it has an essay on South Park in it, which is a very thoughtful and libertarian show. I have a long section on it. There's a episode of South Park called Gnomes, about these invisible gnomes that are stealing people's clothing. That, I think, is the show's representation of the Adam Smith and the invisible hand. That when people look at how the economy operates, they just don't understand it because it's due to invisible forces. But those invisible forces are what really work. So that book was, I think, the most fun to write of my pop culture books.